The day began inside a large convention hall buzzing with noise and energy. Dozens of professionals from different fields had gathered to witness a live demonstration of a new machine that had baffled experts for weeks. 10 highly trained professionals had worked tirelessly on it, but no matter how many hours they poured into the problem, the machine simply refused to function the way it was designed. The audience sat in rows watching the experts circle the machine with furrowed brows and whispers of frustration. Some tapped their pens against clipboards, others shook their heads in disbelief. It was supposed to be the highlight of the event, yet it was turning into a scene of embarrassment. Then, in the back of the hall, a simple woman sat quietly with her hands folded on her lap. Her clothes were plain, her demeanor calm, and unlike the professionals, she held no tools, no papers, no devices. She simply watched, listening intently to every word spoken and every failed attempt carried out. The lead professional finally sighed heavily and admitted defeat, saying it could not be fixed under the current circumstances. The crowd murmured in disappointment. That was when the simple woman slowly stood up. All eyes turned to her, curious and confused by her sudden movement. She stepped forward and spoke in a steady voice, offering to take a look at the machine. The professionals glanced at one another, then laughed under their breath. Who was she to think she could do what 10 trained experts had failed to do? But the audience whispered with intrigue, urging the organizers to give her a chance. Reluctantly, the lead professional stepped aside, his pride clearly wounded. The simple woman walked up to the machine and placed her hands on its surface, as though she were greeting an old friend. She studied the wires, the levers, the small details others had overlooked. The room grew quiet, every sound of laughter fading as her focus deepened. Without any special equipment, she adjusted a few parts, tightened a connection here, loosened a joint there, and realigned a piece that had been ignored. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and precise. Minutes passed, yet to everyone it felt like a lifetime. Finally, she pressed the power switch. The machine whirred to life, with a smooth hum filling the hall with a sound no one had expected to hear that day. Gasps erupted from the audience as the lights flickered on and the machine performed exactly as it was supposed to. The professionals stood frozen, their mouths open in disbelief. The simple woman stepped back with a faint smile, as though it had been the easiest task in the world. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the hall. Some stood on their feet, clapping wildly, others shouted in awe, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The professionals exchanged nervous glances, their pride stung, but their respect undeniable. The lead professional finally walked forward, extending his hand to the simple woman. She accepted it graciously, her humility untouched by the praise flooding toward her. The crowd continued to cheer louder than ever as cameras flashed, capturing the moment. The simple woman had done what 10 professionals could not, and the hall was left in complete awe. The applause continued to grow louder until it felt like the walls themselves were vibrating with energy. People in the back rows were standing on chairs, trying to catch a glimpse of the woman who had just turned failure into triumph. Reporters rushed forward, their cameras flashing and microphones extended as they shouted questions. But the simple woman only stood quietly, her eyes calm, her smile gentle, as though she were untouched by the chaos surrounding her. The organizers scrambled toward the stage, trying to regain order, yet even they were stunned, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. One of them finally took the microphone and announced that history had just been made and that the audience had witnessed something far greater than they had planned. The crowd cheered again, the sound almost deafening. The simple woman stepped away from the machine, letting the professionals swarm around it once more, as though hoping to discover what she had seen that they had missed. They pulled out their tools, notebooks, and devices, but none could replicate the grace and clarity with which she had solved the problem. The lead professional turned to her again, his voice softer now with a mixture of respect and humility. He asked how she had done it, what knowledge or training she possessed that allowed her to succeed where they had failed. The audience leaned in, waiting for her answer. But the simple woman only shook her head and said that sometimes solutions are not found in complicated methods, but in quiet observation and patience. Her words lingered in the air like a lesson carved into stone. The hall grew silent as everyone absorbed her response. For the first time, the professionals lowered their pride and nodded, acknowledging her wisdom. One by one, people began approaching her not with skepticism, but with admiration and gratitude. Children looked at her with shining eyes, seeing her as someone who had proved that greatness does not always come dressed in titles or prestige. An elderly man in the front row wiped a tear from his eye and whispered that she had reminded him of his late wife, who always believed in the strength of simplicity. The woman smiled kindly, but did not linger in the spotlight. She turned to leave quietly, as though the moment belonged not to her, but to the lesson itself. Yet the crowd would not let her slip away so easily. Voices called out, begging her to stay a little longer to share more of her wisdom. The organizers hurried forward, offering her a seat of honor at the event, something usually reserved only for distinguished experts. And so the simple woman sat at the front rows, her presence humbling even the most decorated professionals in the hall. The machine continued to hum steadily in the background, proof of her quiet brilliance. But the story of that day was no longer about the machine. It was about the simple woman whose calm hands and clear mind had left an entire crowd in awe. News of the event spread quickly far beyond the walls of the crowded hall. Within hours, headlines were flashing across screens, calling her the woman who succeeded where experts failed. Clips of the moment were replayed endlessly, showing her calm face and steady hands while the professionals stood speechless. Social media platforms exploded with admiration, people writing messages about how she had restored their faith in humility and simple wisdom. Some even began calling her a hero, while others debated endlessly about how she had managed to see what so many professionals could not. Meanwhile, journalists camped outside her small home, waiting for a glimpse of her, hoping she would share more of her thoughts. But the simple woman carried on with her quiet life, tending to her home, her garden, and her neighbors as though nothing extraordinary had happened. When reporters asked her again and again how she felt, she only said that she was grateful to help and that the machine had simply needed patience. This humility only made the world admire her more. Soon invitations began arriving from universities, research centers, and even international conferences, all begging her to appear and speak about her approach. But the woman hesitated, unsure if the stage and spotlight were where she truly belonged. The professionals who had once dismissed her now wrote her letters filled with respect and requests for guidance. Some even traveled long distances to meet her face to face, hoping she would teach them how to see the world as she did. Her neighbors too began to notice changes in the way others looked at her. The same people who once overlooked her now greeted her warmly, offering help and kindness in return. Yet despite all this recognition, the woman remained unchanged, her spirit calm and grounded, as though the noise of the world could never shake her. Still deep inside, she wondered if her journey was only beginning, and if fate had more tests waiting for her beyond the machine. One evening, as the woman sat quietly by her small table sipping tea, a knock echoed at her door. When she opened it, she found a group of strangers standing there, their faces tense and urgent. They explained that another problem had surfaced, one even more complex than the last, and the professionals were once again at a loss. It was not just a broken machine this time, but a system that connected to an entire town, depending on it for power and safety. If the issue was not solved quickly, families would suffer, businesses would fail, and lives could be put at risk. The woman listened quietly, her eyes calm but focused, as she took in every detail. Though she had not asked for fame or responsibility, she could not ignore the thought of people in need. With quiet resolve, she agreed to see the problem herself. When she arrived at the site, crowds had already gathered, their voices filled with worry and doubt. Among them stood the same professionals who had once doubted her before, now waiting anxiously, hoping she could do what they could not. As she stepped forward, whispers ran through the crowd, some full of hope and others still skeptical. But the woman did not let their voices distract her. She walked straight to the failing system, studying it with the same steady patience she had shown before. Her hands traced the lines of wires and pipes, her eyes scanning each small detail, while silence fell over the watching crowd. The professionals leaned in, desperate to catch even the smallest clue of what she might see that they had overlooked. Minutes passed that felt like hours as everyone waited for her to speak. Finally, she placed her hand gently on one small section that seemed ordinary to others, but to her it spoke volumes. The crowd held its breath watching as she prepared to act, knowing that once again this simple woman might hold the answer none of the experts could see. Do you want me to continue building the suspense by showing how she begins to uncover the hidden flaw in the system? The woman knelt down beside the section she had pointed to and carefully brushed away layers of dust and grime that had gathered over the years. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the connection beneath, and she could see what others had missed, a small fracture that disrupted the entire flow. It was subtle, nearly invisible, unless you looked with patience and understanding. She took a small tool from her pocket, one she had carried for years, and began to make quiet adjustments. The professionals exchanged uneasy glances, their pride wounded, yet their hope slowly rising as they realized she had seen something none of them had. The crowd leaned closer, some holding their breath, as if a single sound could disturb her concentration. The woman worked steadily, her hands calm and confident, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. At last, she tightened one last connection and stepped back quietly. The system flickered, then came to life, with a hum that grew stronger by the second. Lights snapped on, machines roared back into motion, and a wave of relief swept through the crowd. People gasped, some cheered, and others simply stood frozen in disbelief. The professionals stared wide-eyed, unable to comprehend how a simple woman had once again done what their combined knowledge could not. But the woman only smiled softly and wiped her hands as though it had been nothing extraordinary at all. She did not boast, she did not seek applause, she simply turned to leave as the crowd erupted into admiration behind her. Murmurs followed her footsteps, words like genius, miracle, and savior passing from one voice to another. Children pointed at her with wide eyes, while elders nodded with respect. The woman, however, walked with the same humble grace, as always, as though her role had simply been to listen when others had not. And while the town celebrated her quiet strength, a sense of awe lingered heavy in the air. Would you like me to keep showing how her quiet reputation begins to spread far beyond the town, drawing even more powerful eyes toward her? Whispers about the woman traveled faster than anyone expected. By the next morning, people from neighboring towns were arriving, eager to see the one who had done what 10 professionals could not. They wanted to shake her hand, to thank her, to simply be in the presence of someone who had turned the impossible into reality. Journalists showed up with their notebooks, cameras flashing, and microphones pushed forward, asking how she had done it. The woman answered gently with few words, explaining that she had simply observed, listened, and trusted what others overlooked. Her humility only deepened the sense of wonder that surrounded her. The professionals who once doubted her now stood silently in the background, their pride swallowed by undeniable respect. They too began to look at her with admiration, though none of them dared to approach too closely. In the marketplace, her name echoed on every corner, and families told the story as though it had already become legend. Children began pretending to be her in their games, kneeling down and fixing imaginary machines as their friends cheered. Her story reached men in suits who usually never cared for such things, but even they leaned forward curiously when her name was spoken. They wondered who she was, where she came from, and how someone so unassuming could hold knowledge that others could not. At night, the woman returned to her small home where silence and simplicity welcomed her. She sat by the window watching the stars as if they were the only ones she truly needed to speak to. But outside her door, footsteps gathered, people who sought her help with broken tools, weary hearts, and questions no one else could answer. And though she was only one person, she listened to them all. With every act of kindness, her reputation grew, until even the most powerful began to take notice. Would you like me to continue with how powerful figures try to approach her with offers while she remains unchanged in her simplicity? Soon word reached the city, where leaders and powerful figures gathered in tall glass buildings far removed from the simple lives of ordinary people. They sent letters with golden seals and messages delivered by men in polished shoes, inviting the woman to their offices, offering riches, influence, and recognition. But the woman declined each invitation with a gentle shake of her head, explaining that she did not seek wealth or fame, only peace and purpose. This puzzled the men who were used to seeing people chase their rewards with eagerness, yet here stood someone who turned away without hesitation. Still they persisted, sending more envoys, each one carrying promises greater than the last. One arrived with the keys to a grand estate, another with the title of honorary advisor, yet another with the chance to lead entire projects watched by the nation. The woman listened politely and then returned to her garden where she worked quietly, planting seeds, watering the soil, and speaking to the earth as if it were a friend. People from nearby towns continued to come seeking her wisdom, not for glory, but for guidance in their daily struggles. She taught them to look carefully at what was in front of them, to listen patiently, and to trust the answers hidden in the simplest of details. Every lesson she shared made them stronger, not because they were given solutions, but because they learned to find them themselves. The professionals who had once laughed at her now began to walk beside her, learning with humility and respect. And slowly, they too found that their skills sharpened not from textbooks or titles, but from watching how she observed the world with open eyes. As time passed, the woman became not just a figure of awe, but a symbol of possibility. Her presence reminded people that greatness did not always wear fine clothes or live in palaces. Sometimes it walked quietly among them, wearing nothing more than humility and kindness. Crowds grew larger and whispers spread farther until it seemed as though the whole land waited for her next step, her next word, her next quiet act of wisdom. Do you want me to carry the story toward how her influence begins shaping entire communities and even challenging the ways the leaders themselves think? The leaders who once dismissed her began to notice the change among their people. Communities that had been divided found ways to work together, inspired by the lessons the woman quietly shared. Farmers fixed their own tools when once they would have waited for experts. Children solved puzzles faster than their teachers believed possible, simply because they had been taught to look without fear of being wrong. Even the elders found new strength as they realized wisdom was not lost with age, but renewed with every experience. The woman never claimed credit for any of it. She only smiled as she watched them grow stronger day by day, knowing that her role was not to lead, but to awaken what was already inside them. One evening, the leaders themselves left their tall buildings and came to the small garden where the woman still worked. They found her kneeling by a patch of soil, her hands covered in earth, her eyes calm and steady. For the first time, they did not bring gold or promises of titles. Instead, they brought questions, the same kind that their people had once asked. How can we guide without losing sight of those we serve? How can we solve what seems impossible when even our best minds fail? The woman looked up and answered, not with speeches, but with a simple gesture. She handed them a seed and said quietly, "Place it in the ground, water it, care for it, and wait." They hesitated for a moment before obeying her instruction, and though the act seemed small, something shifted inside them. They realized the lesson was not in the seed alone, but in the patience and humility it demanded. From that day on, even the highest among them began to walk the path she had shown, not by command, but by choice. The woman remained the same, humble and steady, yet her quiet influence was now shaping not only villages, but the very heart of those who once believed they knew everything. Would you like me to continue into how her teachings spread beyond the land, reaching strangers in faraway places who had only heard her name in whispers? Word of the woman began to travel farther than the villages and towns around her. Merchants carried tales of her to distant markets, speaking of the quiet strength she carried and the way even the most stubborn disputes seemed to soften when she was present. Travelers who passed through the land took stories of her across mountains and rivers, telling strangers of the woman who had done what 10 professionals could not. Soon her name was spoken in places she had never seen by people she had never met. Some came with curiosity, hoping to witness for themselves the woman who had stirred such change. Others came with doubt, determined to prove that the stories were only illusions or exaggerations. But each who arrived and stayed long enough left with a new understanding, not because she performed miracles, but because she showed them what they already held inside. A young scholar once journeyed many days to find her, his mind heavy with questions he could not solve. He found her by the river mending a basket. Without looking up, she asked, "What troubles you, child?" The scholar poured out his confusion, the problems of numbers and shapes that had tormented him for months. She listened quietly, then dipped her hand into the water, letting it run through her fingers. "The answer is here," she said, "not in the water alone, but in the way it moves and bends without breaking." The scholar watched the stream more carefully than he ever had before, and in time the solution came to him. He fell to his knees, overcome not by her giving him an answer, but by her teaching him how to see. He returned to his city and told others of the woman who taught by silence and simplicity. And just like that, her influence spread beyond the boundaries of her land, touching places she would never walk, yet still transforming them. Do you want me to continue with how rulers from distant lands begin to send for her, hoping to learn from the wisdom that even their courts of advisors could not provide? Years passed, and the woman continued to live as she always had, in simplicity and peace. Though her name traveled across kingdoms and her wisdom was sought by nobles and rulers, she never left her humble home. People continued to arrive from near and far, carrying with them problems they could not solve, questions that weighed heavy on their hearts, and doubts that clouded their vision. She welcomed them all, offering no riches, no promises, only her gentle way of seeing the world. One day, an old traveler asked her why she gave so much of herself when she could have used her gift to gain power and wealth. The woman smiled and said, "Power fades, wealth disappears, but the seeds we plant in the hearts of others will grow long after we are gone." Her words became her legacy, more lasting than gold or monuments. When her time on earth ended, the land mourned, but they did not grieve as those who had lost everything. They carried her lessons in their lives, teaching their children the same patience, kindness, and strength she had shown. And so the simple woman who had done what 10 professionals could not became more than a story. She became a light passed from one generation to the next. Her name was whispered not with grandeur, but with gratitude, a reminder that greatness is not found in titles or treasures, but in the quiet power of humility. The crowd that once laughed at her had long since fallen silent, replaced by voices that spoke her name with awe and respect. And in that silence, her story lived on forever.